It was the summer of 1956 in Memphis, Tennessee. The sweltering heat hung in the air as Richard Hawkins, a renowned journalist known for his ruthless takedowns of religious figures, strode confidently through the grand lobby of the Peabody Hotel. His target that day? The 21-year-old rising star who was causing national hysteria with his swiveling hips and fusion of gospel, blues, and country music. Hawkins had built his career destroying celebrities who claimed to be people of faith, and now he had his sights set on exposing Elvis Presley as the ultimate religious hypocrite. What Hawkins didn't know was that the next 2 hours wouldn't just change his article, they would change his entire perspective on faith, music, and the young man from Tupelo who was about to leave him completely speechless. The journalist clutched his notepad filled with meticulously researched gotcha questions designed to trap Elvis into admitting his religious hypocrisy. His editor at American Critic magazine had already reserved the cover, Elvis Presley, the false prophet of rock and roll. But that cover would never run. By the end of their meeting, Hawkins would find himself staring at Elvis with tears streaming down his face, unable to speak. And the question on everyone's mind, what could a young rock star possibly have said to silence America's most notorious atheist journalist? Hawkins had prepared for weeks, sharpening questions designed to expose what he believed was the blatant contradiction between Elvis's religious upbringing and his obscene performances. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, had actually tried to cancel the interview after learning about Hawkins's reputation for hit jobs on celebrities with religious backgrounds. But what Elvis said next surprised everyone in his entourage. "Let him come, I've got nothing to hide." Was this confidence or naivety from the young star? And why would Elvis willingly put himself in the crosshairs of journalism's most notorious faith basher? When Hawkins entered Suite 1224, he found Elvis alone, unusual for a star typically surrounded by his entourage. Dressed simply in a light blue shirt and dark pants, Elvis greeted the journalist with his characteristic politeness, offering him a seat and something to drink. But Hawkins wasn't there for Southern hospitality. He remained standing, launching immediately into his attack. "Mr. Presley," he began, not bothering to hide his condescension, "how do you reconcile your supposed Christian beliefs with performances that church leaders across America are condemning as obscene and immoral?" What Elvis did next caught Hawkins completely off guard. Instead of becoming defensive or calling for his manager, Elvis simply smiled, gestured again to the chair and said, "Sir, I'd be happy to talk about my faith with you, but I think we might be more comfortable if we sat down like two regular folks just having a conversation. Would that be all right?" The disarming politeness momentarily stunned the journalist. This wasn't how these ambush interviews were supposed to go. Reluctantly, he took a seat, still clutching his notepad like a weapon ready to strike. Little did he know, the weapon he'd brought to this battle would soon prove useless against what was about to unfold. The scheduled 30-minute interview stretched into 1 hour, then 2. Elvis spoke openly about his deep connection to gospel music, his mother's religious influence, and his own personal struggles with fame and faith. But Hawkins wasn't satisfied. He had come for blood, not conversation. Loading his journalistic gun with his most explosive question, he fired what he was certain would be the kill shot to Elvis's religious credibility. "With all due respect, Mr. Presley," Hawkins said with barely concealed disdain, "you can't possibly believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible, talking snakes and worldwide floods while living the life you do. Isn't your religious talk just a way to appease your fans in the Bible Belt?" The room fell silent. This was the moment Hawkins had been waiting for. Either Elvis would anger, proving him right about the superficiality of celebrity faith, or he'd fumble for an answer, exposing his hypocrisy. But what happened instead would become legendary in Tennessee for decades to come. Elvis paused, his blue eyes studying the journalist thoughtfully. Then, instead of defending himself, he asked a question that would change the entire conversation. "Mr. Hawkins, have you ever been so moved by a piece of music that it made you cry?" The journalist, thrown by this unexpected pivot, admitted that yes, certain classical pieces had moved him deeply. "Then you already understand what I believe about God," Elvis replied. "That feeling, that's what I feel when I sing gospel music. That's what I feel when I read certain passages of Scripture. I don't need to defend the logic of every Bible story to know that there's something greater than myself that gave us music, that gave us love, that gave us this connection we can feel but can't fully explain." The journalist's pen froze above his notepad. In all his years of interviewing and demolishing religious figures, no one had ever bypassed his intellectual traps with such emotional authenticity. But what Elvis said next would leave him completely speechless. a response so unexpected that Hawkins would later say it was like having the intellectual rug pulled out from under my feet. You know, Elvis continued, leaning forward slightly, my mama always told me that doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it's part of it. I have plenty of questions myself, but when I sing Peace in the Valley or Take My Hand, Precious Lord, I'm not thinking about whether every word of the Bible is literally true. I'm feeling something that connects me to everyone who's ever looked up at the stars and wondered why we're here. And with all respect, Mr. Hawkins, I think you feel it too when you listen to that classical music that moves you to tears. We might call it by different names, but we're talking about the same thing. Hawkins, a man who had built his career on intellectual dismantling of religious belief, found himself without a ready response. The simplicity and authenticity of Elvis's answer had bypassed his intellectual defenses and struck something deeper, something he wasn't prepared to confront in a hotel room with a rock and roll star he'd come to expose. What was happening? How had this interview so quickly spun beyond his control? And why was he suddenly feeling defensive when he should have been on the attack? But the most powerful moment was yet to come. Sensing the journalist's discomfort, Elvis changed the subject, asking Hawkins about his own background and how he came to be a writer. No celebrity had ever turned the tables on Hawkins this way, showing genuine interest in the man who had come specifically to destroy him. Against his better judgment, the journalist found himself opening up about his own childhood in a strictly religious household, his rebellion against what he saw as hypocrisy, and his embrace of atheism as a young adult. I don't think God minds your questions, Elvis said when Hawkins finished his story. From what I understand about Jesus, he had more problems with people who were too certain they had all the answers than with folks who were honestly searching. Then, in a move that completely disarmed the journalist, Elvis asked if he could play something for him. Without waiting for an answer, he picked up his guitar from beside the sofa, closed his eyes and began to sing a haunting rendition of How Great Thou Art. In the stillness of that hotel room, with no audience except a cynical journalist, Elvis sang with an emotion and authenticity that Hawkins had never witnessed in any of Presley's recordings or performances. What happened next would haunt Hawkins for the rest of his career, a moment so powerful that he would reference it decades later as the closest thing to a religious experience I've ever had, despite still being an atheist. When Elvis finished singing, he opened his eyes and found Hawkins sitting in stunned silence, tears streaming down his face. The journalist quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by this unexpected display of emotion. That's what I was trying to explain, Elvis said gently. That feeling right there, that's what it's all about for me. Not rules or arguments or trying to prove who's right, just that connection to something bigger than ourselves. Hawkins left the interview that day without the hit piece he had planned to write. In fact, he left without writing any piece at all. His editor at American Critic was furious, demanding the promised takedown of the rock and roll star's religious pretensions. But what could Hawkins possibly write now? How could he expose the hypocrisy of a faith he had felt the authenticity of, even if just for a moment? The man who had built a career on words now found himself speechless, unable to translate his experience into the cynical language his readers expected. I went in to expose a hypocrite, he explained to his bewildered editor, but that's not who I met. When pressed for what he had found instead, Hawkins struggled to put it into words. I'm not saying he converted me or anything that dramatic, he insisted. I'm still not a believer. But he made me question whether I understand as much as I thought I did about what belief actually means to someone like him. The editor, sensing a potential scandal if their star atheist writer appeared to be going soft on religion, shelved the story completely. The planned Elvis exposé vanished from their editorial calendar, leaving readers to wonder what had happened to the promised takedown. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. 3 years later, something happened that would shock the journalistic world and forever change how Tennessee viewed its most famous son. In 1959, having left American Critic for a position at a smaller but more independent literary magazine, Hawkins finally broke his silence about the interview that had changed his perspective. What he wrote left readers across America, especially in Tennessee, absolutely stunned. The article, titled simply, An Afternoon with Elvis, presented a thoughtful reflection on faith, doubt, and the power of music to express what words often cannot. Hawkins, known for his scathing critiques of religious figures, had written what amounted to a deeply respectful portrait of Elvis Presley's spiritual life. Religious leaders who had condemned Elvis's performances found themselves confronted with a more complex figure than they had assumed. Fans who had loved Elvis for his music discovered a depth to their idol that mainstream coverage had rarely revealed, and Hawkins's fellow atheist intellectuals were left wondering, had Elvis somehow converted their champion? The answer, as Hawkins made clear in the piece, was no. He remained an atheist, but something more subtle and perhaps more profound had occurred. I went into that hotel room thinking I was going to expose the shallowness of Elvis Presley's faith, he wrote. Instead, he exposed the shallowness of my understanding of what faith can be. That's a gift I never expected from a rock and roll singer, and one I've never forgotten. The article created a sensation, particularly in Tennessee, where it was reprinted in newspapers across the state. People who had dismissed Elvis as a vulgar fad were forced to reconsider their judgments. Those who had defended him felt vindicated, but also gained a deeper appreciation for the young man behind the performances. And perhaps most significantly, religious leaders who had condemned him from pulpits across the South found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being lectured about true Christian values by an atheist journalist who had encountered them in Elvis when he couldn't find them in their churches. When asked about the article in a 1960 press conference, Elvis characteristically downplayed his role. "Mr. Hawkins is a fine writer who gives me too much credit," he told the assembled journalists. "We just had a good talk, that's all." Sometimes when people actually sit down and listen to each other, they find out they're not as different as they thought. This humble response only further cemented the impression Hawkins's article had created of a young star with wisdom beyond his years. But was Elvis's modesty genuine? Or was it part of a carefully constructed public image? Hawkins, who had gone in looking for inauthenticity, had come away convinced of Elvis's sincerity. But not everyone was so easily persuaded. The impact of that interview extended far beyond that initial article. Hawkins, while never abandoning his atheism, went on to write a series of acclaimed pieces exploring the personal meaning of faith for various cultural figures, approaching his subjects with a newfound respect and nuance. His work helped pioneer a more sophisticated form of journalism about religious belief in American public life, one that looked beyond dogma to examine the lived experience of faith and its influence on art and culture. But he never forgot the moment that had changed his approach: a young Elvis Presley, singing with closed eyes in a Memphis hotel room, unaware of the impact he was having on the hardened journalist watching him. As for Elvis, the story of his conversation with Hawkins became something of a legend in Tennessee, particularly among those who felt that the national media too often portrayed Elvis as merely a hip-swiveling teen idol rather than a complex artist with deep roots in spiritual music. The encounter reinforced what many who knew Elvis personally had always understood: behind the jumpsuit and showmanship was a thoughtful young man whose faith informed his music in profound ways, even as he revolutionized American popular culture. But as his fame grew and his health declined in later years, many wondered, did Elvis himself still feel that connection to something greater, or had the pressures of fame and fortune dimmed the spiritual light that had so impressed Hawkins that summer day? Decades later, when Hawkins was asked in an NPR interview whether his encounter with Elvis had changed his own views on religion, the now elderly journalist gave a characteristically nuanced response. "I remain an atheist," he said, "but a more humble one. What Elvis showed me that day wasn't that I should believe what he believed, but that I should question my own certainty about what belief itself means to different people. He taught me that faith isn't always what intellectuals like me think it is, a set of propositions to be argued over. Sometimes it's more like music, something felt and experienced in a way that can't be fully captured in logical arguments." He paused, then added with a small smile, "I went into that hotel room thinking I was going to expose the shallowness of Elvis Presley's faith. Instead, he exposed the shallowness of my understanding of what faith can be." The interviewer, clearly moved by this reflection, asked if Hawkins had ever spoken to Elvis again after that day. "No," the journalist replied, a hint of regret in his voice. "I always meant to, but then life happened, and before I knew it," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elvis's death in 1977 had closed the door on any possibility of a follow-up conversation. But the question remains, what might have come from a second meeting between these two unlikely spiritual companions? When Hawkins's article resurfaced in a 2018 retrospective on religion in American music, it found new relevance in another polarized era. Social media buzzed with discussions about this side of Elvis that many younger fans had never encountered. Some questioned whether the story had been embellished over time, as tales about cultural icons often are. But those who had known Elvis personally confirmed that the Elvis of Hawkins's account, thoughtful, spiritually nuanced, more interested in connection than confrontation, aligned perfectly with the man they had known. One former member of Elvis's band put it simply, that was Elvis to a T. He never tried to convert anybody or push his beliefs on them, but if you asked him, he'd talk about his faith in a way that made you think, really think, even if you didn't agree with him. Perhaps what made Elvis's response to Hawkins so powerful wasn't just what he said, but how he embodied what he believed, meeting judgment with kindness, confrontation with conversation, and intellectual challenge with emotional authenticity. In silencing a journalist known for his cutting takedowns of religious figures, Elvis did more than win an argument. He demonstrated a kind of faith that transcended the narrow categories into which American religion was often divided, one that could speak even to those who had rejected religion altogether. The young man from Tupelo, whose musical innovation would change the landscape of American culture, showed in that hotel room another kind of revolutionary potential, the possibility of dialogue across the deepest divides of belief and doubt, conducted with mutual respect and genuine curiosity. In an America that was just beginning to fracture along the cultural and religious lines that would define later decades, Elvis offered a glimpse of another way, one where faith could be discussed, not as a battleground, but as a shared human search for meaning and connection. As Hawkins himself concluded in his 1959 article, "I came to interview a rock and roll star about the contradictions in his faith. I left having experienced a profound lesson in what faith, at its best, might actually be. Not a weapon or a shield, but a kind of openness to mystery, expressed not primarily through arguments but through art, through music, and through a genuine interest in the stories of others, even those who come with skepticism and doubt. If more religious discourse in America followed the example set by this young singer in a Memphis hotel room, we might find ourselves in a very different national conversation about belief." That conversation in Suite 124 of the Peabody Hotel didn't make Richard Hawkins a believer. But it did something perhaps more remarkable. It made a hardened critic recognize the authentic spiritual depth of a young performer he had planned to dismiss, and in doing so opened a window into a side of Elvis Presley that went far beyond the caricatures of both his defenders and detractors. It revealed Elvis not just as an entertainer who happened to sing gospel music alongside his rock and roll hits, but as an artist whose understanding of faith was as nuanced and profound as his revolutionary impact on American music. In silencing an atheist journalist, not through argument, but through authentic expression of his spiritual experience, Elvis Presley didn't just win an unwinnable debate. He transcended it entirely, offering instead something that both the devout and the doubting could recognize as genuine, a moment of connection across seemingly unbridgeable differences, carried on the power of a voice that could make even a confirmed skeptic feel, if only for a moment, the presence of something sacred in a Memphis hotel room on a summer afternoon in 1956. And perhaps that's the most important part of this extraordinary story. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful response to those who question our deepest beliefs isn't a clever argument or defensive reaction, but simply an authentic demonstration of why those beliefs matter to us. In a world that often seems determined to divide us along lines of faith and doubt, politics and culture, Elvis's approach offers something we desperately need, a reminder that beneath our intellectual disagreements lies a shared human experience of wonder, meaning, and the search for connection that might, if we're willing to truly listen to each other, bridge even the widest divides.